Hey guys, so I wanted to give you a quick short lecture on Rousseau to help kind of supplement your reading here and a little bit of the Kant lectures you're receiving. So I picked Rousseau in one aspect because I think he's obviously a major figure in relation to political and moral philosophy, and Kant in particular calls him, well, that he initiates a Copernican revolution in moral thought. And he ends up being quite influential for Tolstoy and Napoleon and a lot of these other later thinkers. Up to the present day. To kind of begin with this, we are going to be discussing what you guys have been reading is his second discourse, the discourse on inequality, and it's obviously structured very differently from the other texts we've been reading. It seems to be almost like he's recreating almost a history of human development here. And I think one caveat I want to point out, and this you'll see at the very beginning of the first discourse, that wasn't assigned during the readings, is that Rousseau here is not trying to create, like, a scientifically accurate mapping of exactly how humans developed. Rather, he's trying to give a philosophical explanation for his understanding of how humans can develop, to try to explain both his moral psychology and kind of critique other contemporary theorists. And two a little bit older theorists I want to discuss here, one in particular, help position in relationship to to help us understand how Rousseau's thinking. And one of the big ones is Hobbes. You've probably heard of Hobbes. Hobbes is a major political theorist. Hobbes' ethics also kind of builds out of a bit of his political theory. And what's important here is Rousseau's understanding of Hobbes. For Hobbes, humans begin in a state of nature, in a state of war. Hobbes calls it a war of all against all in the Leviathan. And in this is how Hobbes sees humans begin, is that we are basically atomistic individual entities that are all out to kill and destroy the other ones, all out for our own good and all out for our own survival. And ethics is all about who's stronger, the good of the stronger, and who is able to dominate in this kind of all against all. And for Hobbes, his political theory develops out of this, where you have to have a banding together to be able to be stronger, and then a leader to be able to hold that banded group together. And that's how kind of Hobbes' political contract theory ends up developing. Locke is a bit nicer, and Locke doesn't see it necessarily as war of all against all, but kind of as as individual gentlemen meeting up, agreeing on that we might have a social contract to be able to protect our own interests. And in comes Rousseau, much later than both these thinkers, and he's also famously in the social contract tradition. One of his other most famous books, Du Contrat Social, is literally in the title, this idea of a social contract. But for Rousseau, this is a little bit more complicated. His problem with his quibble with Locke is that it doesn't make sense to him how two people can kind of make this agreement for a civilization or political entity or an ethics pre-civilization. For him, it's almost as if Locke presupposes these bourgeois English gentlemen exist in a state of nature and that they can come to this agreement civilly, without any sort of evolution here. So that's part of why he's trying to go back. He's trying to explore a pre-state before we could have this sort of civilization. Because for him, it's like these two entities for Locke just like meet up and presuppose all the kind of social and cultural conventions that they already have. And his quibble with Hobbes is even deeper, because for Hobbes thinks humans are inherently violent towards each other. They inherently have this instinct to want to dominate, to want to kill, and for Rousseau, it's as you have been reading, it's a little bit the opposite. You could almost compare him a little bit to Mencius from our earlier readings. For Rousseau, he does begin with self-interest, and this is an important point here. He does think we prioritize our own self-behavior, but he thinks in the state of nature that we're not inherently violent beings. It doesn't help us to want to knock the other humans out. For Rousseau, we're basically just these wandering animals that kind of live for our own interests. If we meet up with somebody else, we might share a meal or something, but it's not. We might use them to our advantage, but we basically ignore the other humans. And that when you start building small kind of family entities, then we start developing instincts of pity, instincts of love, and those are base instincts, and that these kind of instincts for destruction and killing and murder only kind of arise in a state of inequality, when the differences, the drastic differences of survival end up coming into play. And so for Rousseau's moral psychology here, our base instincts to help, to care for others, that's the priority, and that's the base level there for human behavior. And this is important because, Rousseau goes into this in another one of his texts. You can look up The State of War, where he really takes Hobbes to task in a lot of these problems. But you can even see he also has some of the issues with Locke, because he sees this, like for example, an idea of property as being a necessary starting point to be able to initiate human conflict. And one of the things Rousseau gets accused of is this idea of the noble savage, that oh, humans were just better in the natural state of things. And that's one of the reasons why I'm filming this outside, because if you're talking about Rousseau, you kind of have to deal with the fact of nature, because he thinks humans were built for a certain natural environment, and that we adapt to it to a certain extent, but if we adapt to it too far, that's what starts bringing about the ethical issues, that like the way society is set up, the way language is set up, the way that all other forms of culturalization are set up, tend to disadvantage us, or weaken us, or put us in situations in which we can start behaving more violently towards each other. Now that's kind of like the basic instinct here, and that's the basic kind of principles that I want to go over, is this kind of Rousseau's understanding of the human, and Rousseau's understanding of the human in so far as like how we're oriented to act, and then therefore we can kind of build an ethics out of that, right? That we should be focusing on making sure that we don't allow certain cultural norms or certain other cultural inequalities to like make us act violently towards each other, that our instinct of pity or instinct of care is our first or primary instinct. And that's the one we should be cultivating. And that's, I think, a relevant question to definitely go in, especially when we're comparing it to some of the other thinkers we'll meet, especially like, for example, with Epicurus, because I know a lot of you were concerned about how Epicurus was always so focused on the self, and it was always prioritizing the self here, that we could see someone like Ayn Rand as a contemporary thinker who was very clearly a Hobbesian, which is always about prioritizing the self and prioritizing the self-interest, and not necessarily prioritizing the community interest. Now, as I said before, Rousseau does begin with the self. He does very much acknowledge that you have to begin with the self-interest, but it's never a self-interest at the expense of others. It's a self-interest that then also is able to recognize that we would also want to care for themselves, which you could also see maybe in later thinkers like Husserl or Sartre. There is also legitimate critiques to be had in Rousseau here. I think, especially if you start reading his discussions on women, or the way men and women relate to each other, maybe you can even see some sexist overtones that we would really want to maybe challenge Rousseau for. On the flip side, one of his words that like probably is all made you a little bit weirded out is like the term savages. Now I think this in particular is a bad translation that we have, because the word sauvage in French doesn't necessarily have the same connotation as, like, say, savages in English. It more just means wild, or without the extra additions of civilization. In particular, these are the people that Rousseau likes and thinks function better than a lot of like the extra accumulation. And if you look at, for example, in footnote 16, you can already see some post-colonial critiques of Rousseau, where Rousseau is very critical of how Europeans show up in other cultures and start expecting people to behave along certain lines. He thinks that, well, you watch these Europeans go to these other cultures, the Europeans are able to adapt to these other cultures quite easily and start living amongst them and wanting to stay there, whereas those people from those cultures may not want to adapt to the European modes of life. And I think that this kind of double potential critique allows for us to even see an early critique of colonialism in the 18th century. And so for my last point on Rousseau, is to kind of just in general situate him in relation to this idea of the noble savage, that maybe he does think that humans might function better in an earlier state than, let's say, where he thinks that his contemporary Paris, with all its excesses and all all the money and all the lying and all the two-faced hypocrisy that he sees in his era, that he thinks might be a little bit too much. That he doesn't want to reject all sorts of like technological or like social advancements, but it's about insofar as they are able to help facilitate and not actually hinder the human. And I think that's kind of a greater distinction that we need to get into with Rousseau, is that he's not, because I think this is what he's really trying to get at, for example, in the social contract, is that it's trying to develop a society in which that we can function once we've moved past, without trying to be wrapped up in what he clearly sees as what is almost like a decadent civilization. And so that was my short lecture on Rousseau. Hopefully that helps kind of supplement your reading. Yeah.